Hello, everyone.
Hi.
How's everyone doing?
On this Tuesday, right? Because we stream on Tuesdays.
Yep, yep, definitely on Tuesdays, never on Fridays or other days.
Yep. This is us streaming at our usual Tuesday, and we got started right at 4 and didn't have technical problems at 3:58.
Every week without fail.
Yep, we are the most regular um, stream on the internet, I think.
Lots of fiber.
Well, that's where the moss comes in, as Sin says.
Sarge is my doctor, and
Oh man! Well, welcome. As I said, we have Sarge, we have Sin, we have there is another, as in there is another Star Wars channel, one of our fellow YouTubers. We're here to talk to you today about this book.
Star Wars Myths and Fables by George.
Mm-hmm.
So we will say a couple things just before we get started. Want to remind you that this is going to be a spoiler-y chat.
Yep.
But at the same time, this is not exactly the same kind of book that is easily spoiled. Just because,
Yep.
So take that into consideration.
Yep.
Be talking about today.
Yep. Yeah, because usually I'm very much one, I don't like to know too much about something before I read it, but to be honest, the nature of this, which is not a bad thing at all, it fits this genre completely. With it being myths and fables, it's very much like morality short stories. And as you kind of start the short story, you know where it's going pretty quickly. But it was a lot of fun. Um, as Sin said, a book is pretty. That is one of the best things about it. Is there's these absolutely stunning images. The name of the artist is in the back. Grant Griffin. Really good stuff throughout the book. Um, each of the 9 short stories has a piece of artwork that corresponds to the short story to kind of give you a feel for the tone as the book starts.
Really beautifully done. Even like the typeface is written like a medieval storybook.
Yeah.
The attention to detail that went into the art shows off. And there've been a couple other books, and this is a Disney Press book.
I believe so. Yeah, it says Disney Lucasfilm Press on the back.
Because there have been other books that have had like an emphasis on, like Legends of Luke Skywalker and Guardians of the Whills.
Yes.
Both in particular had a lot of art in it. Those were both Disney. Kind of fits in a style.
Yeah.
Come from. I really appreciate it. Kind of gives you
Definitely
at least something to go off on. And with these stories, they're meant to be like storybook stories.
Yeah.
Like, it gives you something to like imagine or like to show to a kid who you're console and a picture of a gingerbread house to show. Really kind of puts you not so much in the moment of the story, but it puts you kind of in what the book is trying to do.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, it's meant to be, not just a collection of short stories, but a collection of fables, like a moral to each story that you're supposed to like get from it. Yeah, like Sin says, it's a great bedtime book, and it kind of really.
Some of them would give me nightmares as a kid.
Well, just like all the best medieval fables, they're all
right. Yeah, exactly.
They're all terrible, horrifying stories about children in danger.
Yep.
But like even with the first one, which we'll talk about them, I think in turn. I think plan.
Yeah.
But even like with the first one, when it's like, yep, and then the Sand People put out sacrifices every night to the Crate Dragon. I'm like, oh, this is dark. Like this took a turn. They kidnapped people so that they could sacrifice this large monster.
Yep.
This is not what I anticipated.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stories of like, and then the wraith came because none of the children behaved. Like, oh, okay.
Only you had eaten your spinach, he would have struck you down with a lightsaber.
Yep.
Huh.
Just finish your dinner. That's all we ask.
But do you have any other like general impressions before we kind of? There's 9 stories. So
There's 9 stories. Yeah, we should get moving. But I was telling you about this before the stream got started. And there's a very short introduction to the book. And the very first paragraph of the introduction I really liked, and it said, "Across the galaxy, there are tales waiting to be heard and stories longing to be told. Such legends are passed down through generations, spanning millennia, stretching to the farthest reaches of space as they are carried from planet to planet. For stories bind our universe together." And that line is, I mean, if you are like me and you have most of the Star Wars films committed, if not all the Star Wars films committed to memory, you know that's the line for the Force. It surrounds us and penetrates us and binds the galaxy together. And I think that was a very intentional thing to put right in the introduction of the book, is to say, you know, this is, in a way, storytelling is almost our kind of force, if that makes sense. You know, it's not telepathy and it's not levitating objects or Jedi mind tricks, but it is a power. Storytelling is a power we can have, and it can impact our lives. You know, it can tell us a morality tale, like it can change us that way, and it can help us escape and process things. And I really appreciated that right at the beginning.
I mean, I think so too, and it's something that I don't think I thought as much about before I read it. So
Mm-hmm.
as we were talking about it, it was something you kind of texted me as you were reading it, which was a couple of days after I'd gotten into it. And I was like, oh well,
Mm-hmm.
that makes a whole lot more sense if you think about it kind of in that
Right.
context. Um, because you know we've had so many short story compilations in new canon,
Right.
you know, between Legends of Luke and fight stories, and like we have several of them at this point, and I guess I was kind of just expecting it to be another in those lines.
Right.
I didn't appreciate the ways that it was different, and
Mm-hmm.
but the way that it's different is kind of the point
Right.
of the exercise, and so it's, I think, instructive to kind of get that from the start, and I think it tells you a lot about kind of what's going on and what author's trying to accomplish.
Okay.
This is a Port Haven throwback stream to when this was a every week
Yeah. Right.
every week thing. Just want you to be nostalgic for the old days.
So after that brief intermission, I was saying with the that line about um stories being like the Force. Um, Part of the reason why I thought about it, now I had it, and then after a brief intermission, oh, here it is. The reason why I was thinking about it is because of George Mann's good friend, who happens to be Kevin Scott. Um,
Friend of
and
the
it
site.
friend of the site, Kevin Scott. And it made me think of a reference from something else that Kevin wrote. In Tales from Vader's Castle, which conveniently enough, Return to Vader's Castle has just started up again. But there's a line in the very last issue of the first miniseries, which is um, Lena talking about learning about stories from her father. And it says, "Then my father took me aside and said, stories are important. They explain the universe around us and show us the people we ought to be." And I always really liked that line. And I guess that kind of came to mind just because Kevin and George often tweeting.
Well, and I think it's instructive too, um, that you know I think when we think of myths, that
Mm,
like we kind of understand what a myth is, and it takes me to that moment in The Force Awakens where
right.
Ray's like, you know, that stuff was real. Like I never thought that it was.
Hmm.
But when you add the Fables part to it, that's when you get into, you know, these things are trying to tell us something. I think that the fables that we tell ourselves are important too, in terms
Hmm.
of like what lessons we try to teach, particularly our children. Stories are important. Um,
Yeah. And so that was the framing I kind of took with this, and enjoyed. But with that, we can start going into the individual stories if you like.
Perfect. So why don't we start off with first one, which
the
is the
the
Knight
Knight and the
and the Dragon.
Dragon. Uh,
Evocative title there.
yes. Well, and this was a cool one to start with because this felt so much like those medieval tales. And starting with a knight and a dragon was a great way to build up that framing, I think.
I think so too.
Especially as Star Wars understands a knight and as Star Wars understands a dragon. But I also kind of liked it because, in a way, to me, obviously this isn't fully. It's going good. Nice to see you, Bendu. Um, Obviously these stories aren't pure canon and aren't meant to be, but it felt like an explanation for why um sand people did raiding parties
Right.
for really twisted reasons, but then maybe like why they started doing it, because to me there was an obvious feel where, okay, the story could be Obi-Wan,
Right.
but at no point is the main character of a story a specific person that you are supposed to know, but could be a character that you know. Um, so because it's an old Jedi hiding on Tatooine, you think it could be Obi-Wan. But you know, this story really could have been set way back in the KOTOR days, and could be the way Tatooine villagers explain, you know, why did the Sand People raid our cities? Well, it's
Right.
to protect themselves from the dragons.
I mean, and I like too. This is kind of cheesy,
Mm-hmm.
but I like that a series of Star Wars stories starts on Tatooine. That
Yeah.
just feels right. Um, and it puts us in a familiar place, even as it's telling, these kind of retold stories.
Mm-hmm.
In the way we think of knights and dragons as being different than the way we think of knights and dragons in Star Wars. It
Mm-hmm.
kind of it tells us a story that feels like Star Wars and a story that feels like a fable. And
Yeah.
I like that is the introduction to the book. And this is one I'd read before I read the book, because I read it when they released it like months ago, on the website.
Mm-hmm.
But I really liked the story. I liked um, the origin it kind of gives to raiding parties. But I kind of like, that we get the noble Jedi standing up against the dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. It's just such a sort of picturesque story. That I really appreciate.
Yeah, and I liked it too. It really set the tone of, you really got to, it set the tone of it being this morality tale, because you kind of wonder, like, at first you're like, oh, this is a story about the Sand People and how this horrible thing is happening to them. And you're like, oh, the Sand People are doing this terrible thing, and then at the end the Jedi comes to save them, and the Jedi isn't even like, okay, I'll help you guys. It's like, okay, yeah, this terrible thing was happening, but you also were terrible, so I'm just gonna take my new pet dragon and go away.
Right.
It was just like, oh, this is, we're playing like this is I see. I gotcha.
Well, and just whether it's Obi-Wan or not, the idea of a Jedi riding on a great dragon is,
Right. Yeah. I think it was the perfect story to open with in this collection.
I think so too. What about the second one? And we can come back to any of it. But what
Yeah.
about the second one, the droid with a heart?
The Droid with a Heart. This one actually did surprise me a little bit, because you have the piece of art for it, and the first thing I thought of, because you see Grievous, is, oh, maybe this is going to be a story about Grievous, because Grievous is a droid with a heart. Um, and at first, I was a little let down by that, because I so liked the first story with it.
Right.
It could be Obi-Wan, it could not be Obi-Wan, and I was a little bit like, oh, I didn't want a story where like I really knew who it was. And then, of course, what you find out after a few paragraphs is that you're really reading about the tactician droid,
Right.
and that it's the tactician droid who is the droid with the heart, compared to the irony of Grievous has a real heart and has no heart, as it were. Um, and I enjoyed that. It was funny. The campaign that Grievous does, his plan to like attack across the desert. Like literally just a month ago, I watched Lawrence of Arabia for the first time, and so
Uh,
that's all I could. I was like, oh, it's like that. Only Grievous is terrible instead of looked up to as a semi-god. I got it. But, but I was like, that's what kept playing through my head. I don't know if that was an intentional reference or not. But this one, I guess it is still a morality tale because Grievous is really the bad guy, but this was the only one that didn't really have like a bad ending for anyone. Like, yeah, I mean, some of the droids died, and obviously the main character died, but like with honor, not out of punishment.
doesn't the story end with like the droid being revered by the
Yeah.
Republic as like a hero?
Yep.
Um,
The heroes on both sides type.
um, it's it's always funny to me. Revenge of the Sith,
War! The
but
Republic is crumbling under the evil Count Dooku.
I do
Sorry.
like the play on words of the droid with a heart
With a
because
heart. Yeah.
like we think it's going to be about Grievous and it's not. And I like too, and maybe this is just because I'm certain it is. I like that the tactician droid is a callback to like the Clone Wars, and
Mm-hmm.
if you've watched the Clone Wars, then you know exactly what they're talking about. Like you can almost hear that voice in your head of the
Yeah.
tactician droid to like know the time and place of it, which is different than every other story in the book because every other story in the book is meant to be something that can kind of apply, generally speaking, to different things in different places. And this one
Yes.
is specific, but I think it
Mm-hmm.
worked to the extent that it was also
Yes.
and was a story about what acceptable losses are. Like that's Grievous's plan is not just to go across the desert, but to sacrifice most of his army to catch people by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows you kind of the value of life, even if life is droids.
Right. No, for sure. And it is definitely the most specific one, which was interesting. Um, but it was also cool because the tactician droids in Clone Wars were almost always the most cold and most heartless.
Right.
Um, to the extent where when I saw the two characters in the piece of artwork, I thought General Grievous of all people was going to be the one with the heart. Like that's how cold and calculating and maniacal the tactician droids are.
Right.
So that was kind of cool too, just to see that droid in a different role in one story.
Any other thoughts about that one?
No, I think just to make sure we get through all of them, we can keep moving and then maybe hit some overarching things. But the next one, Vengeful Wave. So this one I struggled with, which is not the book's fault. I have a tremendous fear of waves. And this artwork for this page is beautiful, but terrifying because it has a giant wave on it.
I won't leave it on there long. But, so this is more or less a story about greed and also about like natural resources and like the value. Like it's almost like an environmental story.
Yeah.
So you have the Naudilans and the Aqualish. That are on the planet together. And or is it the Aqualish? I know it's
no, it's I'm looking at it here. It's the Anselmi. I can't pronounce anything, but it's Anselmi.
Which was an explanation to me, at least, why the Naudilans are from Gleanselm.
Yeah.
But I always wonder about Star Wars naming convention. But
thank you, Nolan. Nolan is with me.
Well, I'll be sure to set it as like picture when you call me or something. But the iPhone does that thing now where you can set your picture and like force it upon other iPhone users in their contact information. So as soon as you update your iOS, I'll troll you all the time.
You shouldn't have announced that,
Well, but But anyway, so like one group wants to basically exploit the planet and be greedy
Right.
and take more territory, and they end up going like on the surface
Mhm.
because the oceans are not enough and they feel like they're being excluded, and then
Mhm.
the violently through water reclaims itself at the end. Um,
Mhm.
but you have
Yeah.
I know this story was traumatic for you, but do you have
It's like
other?
waves, waves, waves. Like I can handle it underwater. I can handle near the water. But when there's like, and there were two stories in this book where I was like, why? um, but I mean, I did like it. It was I was telling you, I could handle so much of the reading of like, oh, here's this story of all these things that happen to children. But then this was the one where I read it like, yeah, sure, on that planet, there's like the race of good people and the race of bad people because that's how people work.
Yeah.
But like, I understand it's a morality tale. Why don't I like Wavesy? I don't know. I can't say that I don't have anything I can point to. It's just I've had a series. I mean, we can get deep here for a second. I've had like a series of uh, really nasty nightmares with waves, but I don't know if I had the nightmares because I had the fear, or if I have the fear because of the nightmares.
I have a fear of small clustered holes, so I of your fear of like actual
a
phenomena that
thing,
happen in the
that could actually kill me if I was near it.
so um but no, I think you can also imagine this story as being like a story that the Nautilans tell themselves because they are like the heroes of the story, like they're the good
Hmm.
people. So it's like, let's tell the story about why we're the good people, why we're the
Right.
ones that get this planet. So like the point of the story is don't be greedy, but you can almost see it as like a backdoor justification. Like this is why we run this planet is because we were the good ones.
Right. Yeah, that's true. History is usually written by the winning team, so it's pretty valid. Um, and this one I feel like was shorter too. I feel like this one was just page lengthwise. I think it was a little bit shorter, but maybe not.
And you didn't have to work as hard to get to moral of the story was.
Right? Yeah, no, this one was very much like, so here's what happened. Um, but no, it was good. Like the only thing is it just tied into a fear of mine, but that's not unlike myths and fables either to do things that are scary.
You have a fear of large lizards and you very far. And
Right, you gave up really early. That, or if you don't like sand and you find it coarse and rough and irritating, you might not have gotten very far.
it gets everywhere. Oh, but what about the next one?
Wanderer, I believe. And Bindu, I agree. I'm really excited for Resistance Reborn. I have only excited thoughts about that book. So
I,
Wanderers. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say first, I love this picture from the Wanderer.
Oh
I
yeah.
love that he's carrying a shield.
Yes.
I don't know that we've ever seen a canonical Jedi with a shield. So like I get that this is just a mixture of like how we understand like Earth Knights to work, but I don't know. I really love that image. You may continue
Uh,
now.
no, I was to say I do love the image, and what's interesting with this one is this is the only story I think of the ones in the batch that ties into another story later.
It is, yeah.
So you have Wanderer, and then later you have the Dark Wraith, and the two. I don't know if you have it set up in scenes to easily go from one to the other, but the Wanderer and the Darth Wraith images compared to each other is really cool as well. Um, but the story itself for Wanderer was, again, it was like another typical kind of Jedi Knight story. It was this town was constantly in trouble, and it says right here is like a time placement. It says before the city was destroyed by the vengeance of the Dark Wraith. And if you looked at the table of contents before you read the book, like I did, you're like, oh, hey, the Dark Wraith is a story later, so that's weird. Um, but basically it was this town was under attack at different points, and this Jedi Knight would come in and save them. And we know it's a Jedi because we the way the lightsabers talked about and that sort of thing. But the people didn't necessarily know what a Jedi was, which was really interesting.
Well, and I liked seeing, like, you almost wonder why the Jedi is still on this planet. Kind of where my mind went. But
Hmm.
I like seeing a Jedi sort of cast themselves as the protector of a
Yeah,
place, whether you're protecting it from pirates or from like a literal storm. Um, they're like standing on the beach, keeping the storm back. Like, I don't
right.
know, it's such a powerful image of what it means for a Jedi to be a protector. Um,
Yes.
I also love, and we can talk about this more when we get to the Dark Wraith story, but I
Hmm.
love that the story that is the good guys and
Hmm.
and this story is the story
Yeah.
that's like the bad example of people when you get to the Dark Wraith,
The Dark Wraith, yeah.
and you can see
Which
how
goes
like
to what
there
you
are
were saying.
competing myths.
Yep, about the previous story. Um, Nolan, this is a book. We're talking about a book that's a collection of short stories that are not really canon. They're short. They're stories that would have been told within the Star Wars universe. So it is a picture of a Jedi with a shield, but it's not canonical that there was a Jedi with a shield. So depending on how you define real, I guess. But no, I liked this too, and I just it to me it felt like that kind of archetypal Jedi story is, coming from the original trilogy where you had Obi-Wan out protecting Luke, or even some stuff that happens in KOTOR where you really just feel like you're this Jedi going around and doing things. Yes, you have a mission maybe from the council, but you also kind of have this free reign to go to planets and just do stuff. And it felt very much in that line of thinking. It was a lot of fun for me being such a Jedi fan to have that kind of tone.
And to go back to the moment from the Force Awakens, I think it really speaks to this idea that the Jedi themselves took on
Hmm.
this like mythical nature. Where like if you grew up hearing this story all the time about this guy with a light sword who came and saved the day, and
Hmm.
then you encounter a Jedi, you might be, oh, I like I always thought that was just a story and it's a real thing, and like you kind of get the interplay between what's myth and what's real there.
Hmm.
I like that a lot too.
It said after the last time he protected them, it said never again was the Wanderer seen by the people of Solace, which Solace was just an interesting name for the town anyway. Not even when the Dark Wraith rose from the underworld to strike them down, and yet his story persists amongst those who survived the ruination. Uh, And again, I mean, maybe we could just skip and talk about the Dark Wraith now,
Yeah,
just
that's
because I
fine.
feel like these two stories are so connected. But then you get to the story about the Dark Wraith, and it from the perspective of another city, and it's how the city of Solace that was in the Wanderer ultimately got destroyed. And it's cool. Maybe cool is not the right word, but I just overuse the word interesting, and I'm trying not to use it for every time I have a thought. But it is interesting because on the one hand, you look at the picture of the Dark Wraith, and it's really easy to think that looks like Vader. With the helmet, with the cape, and the mechanical bits. But then you look at the picture of the Wanderer, and the Wanderer almost looks more like Luke. Like he's got the green lightsaber instead of the blue saber. Nothing really about how he's dressed is iconography. I whatever his any kind of icons that would have recognized been like Anakin. Anakin never really had a beard. Um, so it's almost like part of it implies this Anakin Vader relationship where the good guy disappeared and then the Wraith showed up, right? So
Right.
Anakin disappeared and then became Vader. But then it's almost like the mirror image that really is Vader and Luke, as much as it is Anakin and Vader. But I also don't think it's meant to be somebody specific. I was kind of telling you my head canon for how this story would come about isn't even like somebody saw Vader and wrote a story about him, but like maybe somebody on this planet had a force vision of Anakin, of Vader, of Luke, and because they weren't Jedi, weren't trained, and didn't know what to do with it, so they came up with this fable of these characters. And so It's more that if somebody from this world saw Vader, they would say, "Oh, it's the Dark Wraith." Then somebody saw Darth Vader and invented this. Now, there's nothing in this book that says one way or another, but
Kind of use Vader as a way of like making real a story that
right.
I mean, I don't know though. I like the idea. I think there's
It would
something, and I like that idea specifically. I also like that like that it leaves it open as to whether
yeah,
the Wanderer and the Dark Wraith are the same person. You know,
yeah,
this idea that I protected you until you were no longer worthy of my protection.
right.
And so like I don't know, in terms of like Fables, that's dark, but that's like in line with a fable to be.
Well, and even if you think about the nature of the Force, if there's a dark side and a light side of the Force, if you're thinking of the Force as a god, if you're thinking of the Force as a system of justice as opposed to a series of powers that you use, the Wanderer could be the merciful light side that comes in and protects the town up until a point. And then the Dark Wraith is the justice of the dark side, and they could both be the same and not be the same at the same time.
Right. I mean, it's interesting to me too because I think the implication is if the city of Solace is destroyed, then people stop telling the story of the Wanderer. Like this is
Yeah.
like even if it's not the same person, like this
Mm-hmm.
story replaces that story, and like the cautionary tale changes. And I like that we're given these as kind of point and counterpoint either
Yeah.
way, and I think it says something about the stories themselves. It also says something about the level of creativity that went into like writing them and writing them in
Mm-hmm.
this way. That not all of them were interconnected, but that these two very specific ones were, and that they're separated both in time and like in the books. Like they're not even back to back in the book, and so it kind of
Yeah.
implies like a distance, but still a
Mm-hmm.
connection. I don't know. I think it's really well done.
It is. The one thing I would wonder, should we ever get the ability to talk to the author, is why not make it the first and last story of the book? Why is it the third and penultimate story in the book? Um, but I do like the interconnectedness, and I do like that I had to read uh, time in between them to kind of come back and go, oh. But I was going to say, just to what you were talking about the two different aspects, is even if you look, the city in the Wanderer is Solace, and the city in the Dark Wraith is the city of Mock. And so while Solace and Mocking are not necessarily opposites, but they are from just they invoke different ideas, different tones.
Thanks, Neil.
Yeah. If we
Talk
go
about
back into order, so then it would be the Black Spire, which takes place on my new favorite planet.
of Hoth.
I love Hoth. I love Hoth so freaking much.
But no, on Batu. So we've spent a lot of time um, in universe and on our streamcast in Batu lately. But I like that we get another Batu story.
I think mentally I've lived in Batu. I've never been. I've not been to Galaxy's Edge, but I feel like I live there in my mind all the time.
I just keep thinking it's probably good that I've not been yet because, like, if I go, like, my impulse is just going to be to stay, and they're going to
Yeah.
have to like forcibly drag me out of the park. Can't tell me that hasn't happened yet.
Right. My fear is I see all these cool stories about like Rey and Kylo and Vi interacting with everyone, but it's always children. And I'm like, okay, yeah, they're going to play with the 7-year-old. They're not going to come play with the 29-year-old with the YouTube channel, like who's just hanging out. And so I need to set my expectations to be completely ignored, which isn't a bad thing. They should pay attention to the 9-year-olds. I'm not complaining. But like there's going to be a part of me that has to like remember that I'm not 9 when I'm there and to not get in the way of the actual 9-year-olds.
Just always
Anyway,
do your best to appear younger.
right, yeah. Most people think I'm younger than I am, so maybe I could get by. But
But
anyway,
so this story is kind of another dual story in terms of like the morality of it. One, don't wander far away from home and mind your mom, but also like be willing to sacrifice and go and save your sibling brave when bravery is called for. Um, but I really like this story. So like different siblings get taken by this slaver essentially and forced into
Yep.
labor, and then the youngest sibling goes and rescues them, and it's really a nice story about love and affection and care between
Hmm.
siblings, but also like standing up to evil and like that.
Yeah. And this one, I, at some level, I think maybe the reason why the main character, why she doesn't get taken or punished as much is probably because as much as she went and was going where she and her siblings weren't supposed to be, she was probably largely doing it to follow her siblings and not out of mischievousness. Um, but it's also, interesting that it's, the youngest sibling and not the oldest sibling. And, this idea of the youngest one kind of renewing and rescuing everyone. But it is terrifying. It's like one of those really scary kids movies that you watch and you grow up and you're like, oh, that's the movie that gave me nightmares. It all makes sense now.
You
Um, but this idea that this group of people conceivably just takes children, and you can't even go play in a meadow or they'll take you. Um, the interesting part in this too is when she's all alone and she's in the woods. There's a someone shows up and carves the knife for her and encourages her, and it's a little bit frustrating because it's like, why don't you go help her? Like, why are
know,
you sending a child? But there's a part of me that wonders, again, in my kind of head canon when I read it, if maybe he wasn't a real person. Like maybe he's one of the ancients that are talked about, in the Black Spire novel by Delilah Dawson, and I would presume was also mentioned in A Crash of Fate, but I read that one so fast.
well,
I
and
can
I
only remember so much.
like too that the framing device of this is that
Hmm.
the Black Spire is so old and has seen all these different
Yeah.
like framing device of it cast in universe in Batu and
Hmm.
oh I like everything we get about Batu basically.
Yeah. If it's on Batu, I'm happy. And this really was one of, I mean, I guess there's only 9, but I would put this in the top half, I would say, of the 9 stories I read.
And I think
Um,
there's something to your interpretation of it being an ancient too, because
hmm.
like at one point she passes by the wishing tree, like
Yeah.
hopes that some kind of solution makes
Will
itself
find
apparent,
itself.
and then it does.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also just like it as the next, the kind of Batu explanation for what the Black Spire is. And it's this idea of there used to be these massive trees, that became petrified, and it's like so many of the other stories. It's as if it absorbed all of the sins of the people on the planet that it eventually rotted into this Black Spire. But this almost had like a kind of a Peter Pan-esque feel to it to me for some reason.
I think the art
I,
kind of
yeah, I
and
can't explain why, but I kept thinking of either Peter Pan or the movie Hook when I was reading it. And it's not like the story matches at all, but for some reason that's just where my mind kept going.
and except for that one scene where they go to eat and no food on the table and they have to use their imagination,
Yeah,
that
that's
scene
true.
was pretty similar. Apart from that,
Oh
what
man.
about the next the next story? Um,
Gaze of Stone. This is another one I really enjoyed.
I think this is probably
Um,
my favorite of the
mhm.
stories, just because one, it's about the ancient Sith, and that's
Yep.
just something I find interesting. Like talking about. But this was kind of a story about hubris,
Yeah.
which is interesting given it's a story like about Sith because that's kind of supposed to
Right.
be the point, and
Yeah, is that you have a big ego.
unless you're Fred the Jovial Sith, just wants
Right. He
to
just wants
make
everyone to
cookies.
have cookies. Yep.
Um, but but like it's this legend that like Sith tell themselves about an apprentice who reached too far, and um And that's kind of like the point of being a Sith apprentice, is that you're supposed to try to overtake your master.
Overcome it, yeah. It really felt like it was in this tale of don't be a mischievous child, but like this is what Sith would tell their Sith children. Like,
Yeah.
don't grow up to kill your master one day, or he'll turn you to stone. But what I appreciated deep down is just not that this is really truly canon in any way, but it says it's on the desolate planet of Moraband, and Moraband is the planet in the sixth season of the Clone Wars. Yoda goes on his big quest, and he goes to a planet that has a supposed Force ghost of Darth Bane, and the planet is called Moraband, but it's really Korriban.
Yeah.
And they changed Korriban because I guess George Lucas didn't like Korriban and Coruscant, and so he wanted to call it something else. And anyway, we love you, George Lucas. But I appreciated that it was called Moraband, but then thousands of years or more since the ancient times when the world was known as Korriban, and I'm like, okay, see, planets can have two names. Planets are allowed to have two names. Like, planets can have two names.
I like that too, and I like that. It's so far back in time on Korriban that like they don't know what the statue is for,
Right.
And like so there's all these different stories about what it is, and then like whoever is telling this story like knows the real story, and I like that too. Yeah, Nolan Coke is now canonically Star Wars, so
Yeah.
that's the thing that could happen.
You just never know in this day and age. But I also liked it too, just because I feel like we got so many stories, like with the Knight and the Dragon, with the Wanderer, and even though the Dark Wraith is about a dark side-esque being, it's still from the perspective of a light sider, where the Dark Wraith is scary. But like this was a fable about the dark side that wasn't really where the dark side was. I mean, it was the bad guys, but it wasn't. Like, it was kind of cool to just read something from that perspective.
And I don't know, I go back to this, and I know I said this a minute, but it's just so ironic to me that this is a story about the downside of betrayal.
Right.
When that is like the culture of Sith Lords is betrayal.
Yep. Yep.
So it almost becomes a story about, I mean, you could read it as less a story about betrayal and like more of a story about, the dark side appreciates real power. So don't betray someone unless you possess like real power, or else there are consequences for it.
I mean, they say that the galaxy will always need a Darth Treya.
There
but like I said, and it was just cool that it was a statue, and this is one of the stories where I was saying, that's not necessarily a book with spoilers in it, because you start right off the bat, and you can see there's these two characters, and one of them is a statue, and you're reading about this statue, and it becomes pretty apparent when you read the story who's going to be the statue.
Yeah.
And so it's, instead of a story that rides on a plot twist, it's more of a story that rides on inevitability, and like the inevitability of where greed or a lust for power takes you. And that was just kind of an interesting thing to follow.
Also kind of like the idea, talking about stories, like if there were ever another book of these stories, like the way it talks about the apprentice as being trapped in the statue.
Yeah.
Not like necessarily like turned to stone, but still like alive within the stone to be punished.
Yeah.
Because it talks about, occasionally the statue will cry. Stuff like that. I like the idea that in another story, like the statue comes to life or something like that, and like have more continuity between stories if we ever got another volume of this. I think this was probably my favorite.
I definitely enjoyed it a lot. The next one is The Witch and the Wookiee. This one was not about children for once. It was 3 pirates have swindled other pirates and taken their pirate treasure, and they're looking for a place to hide it. They go to a planet in the Hoth system that is not at all like Hoth. It is not covered in snow and ice. It is a jungle world. Um, and they're looking for a place to hide their treasure, as pirates do. And they find this little old lady who's kind to them and offers them shelter and food. And then she has a bunch of treasure, so their plan becomes to rip her off. But then it turns out she is the witch in the title of the story. And I personally read it as if, again, they don't say it for a fact, but I read it as if she could have been a Dathomir witch, a Night Sister. Even to the point where they're like, "Do you have family?" And she's like, "I used to have sisters, but I don't anymore." And I think it's Dooku, but the Night Sisters get wiped out in the Clone Wars at one point, so it would work for her to be Dathmiri, but of course it never spells that out completely.
That's not something I picked up on the first time I read it. Something that they're leaving there for to draw that connection.
Mm-hmm.
And this was another story about greed.
Mm-hmm.
They stole all of this and they got it stolen. But I like this story. This was not one of the ones that kind of stands out in my mind as my favorite.
Yeah, and what's interesting in this one, much like the Gaze into Stone one, is even though there's a morality to not be greedy, there's still almost like the devil figure that gets to be greedy with no consequence, right? So the Sith Lord gets to have his power. It's the apprentice that's greedy, and here the witch gets to keep her treasure and gain more treasure with seemingly no consequence, but it's the pirates who are punished.
Right.
And to me, that's, if you think about the idea that there is evil in the world, it kind of goes to that, where you just got to be careful not to become like that evil. That there is this kind of dark side-esque thing to the world, that you don't want to be like, that do these horrible things to other people.
That leads us to the last one.
Yes, skipping back over Dark Wraith because we talked about that one a little bit. Chasing Ghosts.
Which I like because it's a story about stories.
Yeah.
And I like that this is the last one here too. That becomes a story that is about the nature of storytelling. But you want to walk us through the specifics of it?
So again, I like it because we're back on Batu.
I do too.
And on Batu, it's this one guy who's trying to get away from a bounty hunter, and he knows this bounty hunter won't stop, and she's been chasing him throughout the galaxy for a very long time. So he goes to Batu, and he strategically tells this fanciful story, basically knowing the only way to get this bounty hunter off his tail is to send her after an even bigger bounty. And inadvertently, while trying to save himself, he does save himself, but comes up with the greatest tale in all of the galaxy that people go on to tell forever, which is cool, like you said, because it's the nature of storytelling itself. But it's also, even though it's not the origin for the stories within this book, it's almost like saying the origin of stories, right? Yeah. Like sometimes it's what the introduction talks about, and it's this morality that can kind of bind us, but it can also be a way to change reality and escape, as it were. Like that just hit me. It's a literal way of saying that stories are an escape. Perhaps maybe that's reaching a little bit, but
no, I like that a lot.
Yeah.
I like the story that he tells, but I also, like I said, I like the point of it is that the story kind of takes on a life of its own and changes, and like the origin of it is forgotten because, and I think it's so true about stories, but I like that that's kind of the end. Like if the introduction is is one bookend, that this story about the nature of stories is the end. Of this thematically ties it together.
Yeah, and that's I mean, we were talking about Legends of Luke Skywalker earlier, which is very similar. It has the tales within the Star Wars universe that people would tell, but Legends of Luke had that framing device. It had a bunch of kids on a spaceship telling each other stories. And so that story of the kids interacting was considered canon, but the stories they were telling within it were ambiguously canon. This book was a little bit different because it didn't have that framing device. The closest thing you got to a framing device was the introduction, um, and which I appreciated because I feel like if I were a kid on Naboo and I went to a what would be the same thing as a bookstore, I wouldn't pick up something that made out of paper, obviously, if I was in Star Wars, but this is the book I would get, and these are the stories I would find, and that was the fun for me, is to sit there and pretend I was a kid in the Star Wars universe reading these tales.
So I kind of have a question for you, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe this is a way to kind of move us towards wrapping things up.
Mm-hmm.
But so we understand that these are like in universe
Yep.
myths and fables.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously in terms of like the way publishers decide things, it's meant to be a young adult to junior kind of book. But
Yep.
like, one day when you have children, is this the type of thing? Would you pull these out and read these as bedtime stories? Are they too dark for that? Is it too like in joke is not the right word, but like too
Right.
in universe that you lose the context of it? Um, if you don't have that, like as a book of fables and fairy
Mm-hmm.
tales, does it
Yeah.
work as that? Like, could you read it as that?
That's a good question. Um, as far as the dark content, I think it would depend. I would have been a total wuss about these stories as a kid. I was a wuss in general. When I was little, I couldn't watch Return of the Jedi because the Emperor was too scary. Like when I was a little kid, I literally only watched A New Hope because both Empire and Jedi scared me so much. If my kids were anything like me, I would probably not read it to them because they would probably be as terrified. But that said, depending on the kid, I don't think I think this is readable to some kids that are tougher than they seem. As far as what it would make sense, I mean, little things like Moraband and Korriban wouldn't make sense, or you might not know that the knight is like Obi-Wan. But I think the stories still work. I mean, I think they work as much as reading stories about dwarves and orcs, because it's not like you see one of those on your preschool field trip. Um, so I think this is readable regardless, and I think it would be kind of a fun way to almost. It would be interesting to have like a 4-year-old have this be their first introduction to Star Wars, and then would they watch A New Hope and wonder if Obi-Wan was like the knight instead of is the knight like Obi-Wan.
I think that's exactly true.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts about the book before today?
I mean, just from the review sense, I really liked it. I think it's a book that can catch you off guard if you don't know what it is going in. If you are expecting something that's either a little bit more referencey or something that's a little bit more canon solid, it might surprise you. But that's not what it is. It's literally just a book of fairy tales, and I think it does a great job of being what it is. And I think that it's something where I could read it again and pick up on stuff that I didn't pick up on the first time.
I think so too, and I think it's really well done, and I hope that George Mann gets to do more.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's going to do it for us today. So, all of the things, you know where to find us on all of the social media platforms of your choice. Yep, they're in the corner. You can see them,
Mm-hmm.
and you can follow us and talk to us. If you want to check out our Discord, that is linked below. You can find us there. That is
Yep.
where we get the most up to date information about what we're doing and when.
Yep.
So that just in case we don't stream every Tuesday like we're doing.
Right, exactly, because
then
today's definitely Tuesday.
that's when you would know that. That's where you would find that information most often. It's where you can come and talk to us about stuff.
Yep.
But yep, and then the link should be there. But I think that's gonna do it for us today. We hope you guys have had a good time hanging out with us, and we next week.
Bye.